A second. Great. I think we are live now. So we're live at YouTube channel and here in a StreamYard room with students as well as our invitees from today's session, and we are pleased to announce that Professor Larry Swatuk is here with us in this afternoon in Brazil, morning in Canada, in the United States, I suppose, and we are very pleased to receive Professor Larry Swatuk, as well as our foreign visiting professor, Professor Peter Vale from Pretoria University, as well as from the Federal University of Santa Maria. And we are having here an open class as a part of a course Professor Peter Vale is teaching this semester entitled Questioning Mainstream Security Studies, and which deals with many new approaches and agendas in security studies. And kindly we are welcoming Professor Larry Swatuk here with us. So I'm Igor Castellano. I'm currently the head of the master's program here at the Federal University of Santa Maria in Brazil, and I'm just starting today the streaming to introduce Professor Larry Swatuk. Larry is professor in the School of Environment, Enterprise and Development at the University of Waterloo in Canada. He's also extraordinary professor of the Institute for Water Studies, University of the Western Cape in South Africa, and external researcher of the Bonn International Centre for Conflict Studies in Germany. Prior to joining the Waterloo University, Professor Swatuk spent 11 years at the University of Botswana, 7 years on the main campus in the capital city of Gaborone, and 4 years as Associate Professor of Natural Resources Governance at the Okavango Research Institute in Maun, Botswana as well. His recent research focuses on the unintended negative consequences of state-led climate action leading to potential boomerang effects. So we're going to talk about that today and discuss the implications to the security studies and international and global security. Among his most recent publications are the co-edited collections with Dr. Corrine Cash entitled The Political Economy of Urban Water Climate Change, from Palgrave 2022, and The Political Economy of Climate Finance, Lessons from International Development, as well from by Palgrave 2022. So Professor Larry Swatuk, many thanks for your presence here today, for your generosity, your kindness to give us your ideas and insights on such a important, relevant topic for security studies and as well as for international relations studies. Many thanks for Professor Larry Swatuk, and I give the floor for Professor Peter Vale to make other remarks as well as to mediate this debate. Thanks as well, Professor Peter Vale.
Thank you very much, Igor. I just really want to do two things because the main show here is my friend Larry Swatuk. Larry, as I said to you in an email earlier this week, what we're trying to do in this course is look at the challenges not only that security studies faces from a changing world, which is the permanent condition of security studies, but also to try and challenge thinking about mainstream security studies, which is work that you and I have been doing for 30 years, but also tried to challenge, if I can be provocative here, to challenge those that are challenging security studies, mainstream security studies, because the world is changing so quickly, and you know this better than most people, that I don't think that this term security has any currency anymore. So part of what we're doing is to try and explore the idea of security in its different dimensions, these three triangles, one on top of the other, this triangle, and then to see if there are other words or other concepts that we can find to bring in to the study of security. So that's that part of the introduction, to position you in the context of what you're going to say. What I want to say to the class is, bon dia. Thanks for being here this afternoon. I think you're in for a treat. Larry Swatuk and I have been working together for 30, maybe 35 years. I know my kids were very small when they first met him, and they're very big and no longer quite as expensive now as they were when they were younger. So we've worked together and written many papers together. And as a flavor of the work we've done together, let me give you two notions of what we've done. Soon after apartheid came to South Africa, apartheid ended and democracy came to South Africa and to Southern Africa, we wrote a paper which has been quite highly cited on why democracy is not enough. And I think that was an attack to try and say it's fine to say democracy, but as you know, in Brazil, and you've experienced these last month or so, democracy is not enough. So this paper of ours dealt with Southern Africa and the question of changing nature of Southern Africa. And then we wrote another paper which comes to this from the other end, on prefigurative politics, how people can think of politics that are coming. And this has also been an interesting paper that we wrote, quite highly cited. So Larry and I have been in a conversation for 30 years on this. I always learn something from him. Whether he learns from me is a different question. That's for him to answer. But Larry, thanks for doing this, my friend. Really appreciate it. The floor is yours.
All right, thanks very much, Peter. Bom dia, muito bom estar aqui. It's very nice to be here. And you forgot the middle piece, right? Because we also did this edited collection. That's where right. we basically challenged the dominant concepts and tried to of international relations and filtered them through Southern Africa, right? And you know, I don't know how well cited that was, but that book is free for download online. So if anybody wants to look at, I don't even remember what it was called. It was what was it called? Southern Africa. Anyway,
Southern Africa theoretical perspectives or something. Like
it was called. I have it on the wall here somewhere.
I have it.
Yeah. Oh, there it is. It's theory change in Southern Africa's future. Yeah. And we had actually tried to say, okay, there's lots of people hypothesizing about the post-apartheid future for Southern Africa. They're bringing these different lenses of analysis. When I lived in Botswana, I used to have a regular visit from Europeans coming to tell me what was happening around me. You know, how the Okavango River Basin management was evidence of the validity of liberal institutionalism. And I would say, well, how do you know that? And they said, well, you know, I read a lot from Norway or something like that, you know. So I think part of the challenge, right, is always to, you know, position yourself. And I find it very funny myself now. I mean, I'm in my office in Canada, looking out the window. There's nothing but snow, and last night on the way to the airport, I had a guy from Ethiopia drive me there. We talked a lot about, you know, because I spent so many years in Africa. I still work. In fact, I'm working in South Sudan. I'm going to go to a place called Wow in March. to run a training in water treatment and water quality. And there's a massive disorientation about how do you think about things? So how do you anchor a concept into what kind of reality? And somehow, and as I'm going to talk about today, and I'm going to put the presentation up in a minute, and I hope I'm not speaking too fast for the class. I don't know who's online here. I just see Peter and I. But there are certain kinds of ideas that are sticky, and they're hard to dislodge, and in my view they are obstructive in the same way that as you're walking across a floor of ideas, you put your foot on a sticky part and you can't move forward, and somehow, even though you're surrounded by other ideas, you can't get off of this sticky idea. And as you're going to see in a second, this is in the context of security studies, or mainstream or critical security studies. There are certain kinds of sticky ideas in relation to water and the environment that prevent us from actually moving toward a new way of seeing and being and doing. So I'll share my presentation now. That's kind of a long-winded introduction, but I'll share my presentation now. I have no idea how much background in water resources anybody has in this call, so I've put some basic slides to try to level the playing field, but also to help you see why I'm so concerned about the more orthodox understandings of water insecurity, such as the link that Peter sent from the risk management folks. I forget what that was, but water being the 10th most serious risk on the planet. I mean, we can't live without water. Why is it not the most important thing of all? I'm not quite sure about that either. All right, so I'll share my screen and give you some kind of basic background, and then we'll get into the kind of the narratives and the ideas around water insecurity. Okay. Right. So I'm assuming everybody can see my picture of the elephants arranged around this. Actually, it's a borehole in Etosha National Park in Namibia. It's an artificial water point, and that the Department of Natural Resources in Namibia has drilled because in order to earn tourist dollars, you have to have animals, and animals need to drink. And in the dry season, those elephants would go somewhere else. So to keep them in the park, you have to bring the water to the elephants, which is interesting to me. I mean, I like this picture, and you see that my talk is called "Water in and for Security: In Search of New Ideas." A dominant idea is that might makes right, and we always talk about the lion's share, right? So that the big and powerful always get their way. I wonder about that, but we're seeing a kind of how it's playing out in the Ukraine at the moment. But it's a dominant idea, and of course, what you don't see. So you see the elephants here as the dominant mammal in the region, but what you don't see is hiding in the trees. Actually, if you look very closely, you can see one or two zebras in the background. There's always the smaller animals who are equally thirsty to the elephants, but they have to wait their turn. And in some ways, you can also, so this is you can interpret this through a dominant lens that might makes right, or the powerful get what they want, and the weak have to make do with what's coming. But if you also think of it about certain ideas, right? This is there are certain ideas that are big and powerful, and when you try to come at them, it's very difficult to move them out of the way. And in this case, eventually the elephants will move away and let the other animals come. But in the case of ideas, some ideas seem never to want to move out of the way. So what's that dominant idea? Well, of course, water wars is this narrative, right? The water wars narrative is back in force. I have spent, sadly, I mean, at least 35 years arguing against this narrative. Almost anybody who is involved from a scientific perspective in water issues, from hydrologists, geohydrologists, and so on, will tell you that that there's always water, right? That the think about having to fight to go to war, to mobilize armies around water is a foolish idea, but it never goes anywhere. It sticks. It's a sticky idea. And so you tend to, this is an image that sticks in your mind. You know, these are two zebra also in Etosha Park. You can see how dry it is. And the image is always this one, that water, we're running out of water. Look how dry it is. But if you came in the rainy season, this would be covered in about, I'd say 50 centimeters of water. And then as that water soaked in and receded, all of that grass would grow and it would be lush and green and beautiful. But you neither see that picture very often, nor do you see the fluctuation, right? That from plenty to scarcity, as a system that goes round and round. You get this image, and this is the image, the popular image that sticks in your mind. I want to quote from a recent editorial in Nature Sustainability in relation to what I'm on about here. And I'm just going to read the red part. And so Nature Sustainability is starting a new journal called Nature Water, and their argument is that somehow that we're failing to add new value, new ideas, that we're somehow going round in circles. And they say, in a world suffering as we speak from increasing threats of both too much water and not enough at the same time, water studies needs to confront the reality that it may be pursuing too many publications and not enough ideas. This is an untenable model for the field and a potential danger to society. So to emphasize there, that there's too many publications and not enough ideas, that maybe we have found a kind of a comfort zone where we happily, go to the same journal, read the same ideas, quote from the same people. We get, we quote the editors. You have to publish to get a job and so on. And we just keep going round and round without really trying to challenge or think more deeply about what it is we're talking about. And as Peter said earlier, that this goes as much for critical security studies or critical studies of any kind as it does for mainstream and orthodox. That it's not necessarily a case of whose truth, but the fact that no one is even interested in the conversation around the issue that seems to be animating so much energy. Now, let me just say a few things about water in general. The dominant issue that is given to us in the media is that we are a blue planet, that the so-called freshwater lens. You see that blue dot there? I don't know if you can see my pointer, but that blue dot, 2.5% fresh water, that lens, is reduced down to the little green dot there that says there's only 2.5% of all the water on the planet is potable, drinkable, but most of it is wrapped up in glaciers and snow cover. Well, climate change is changing that. A lot of it is in groundwater. Our technologies are changing that. But nevertheless, they say that the readily accessible amount of water that we have is only 0.3%. And so it's that image of fragility, of limits, of scarcity that gets us all worked up, right? That yes, this is something we might lose, and we're going to possibly run out if we don't behave better in relation to how we manage that resource. But from my own perspective, well, we know that water is a cycle, right? There's a hydrological cycle. There's evaporation off the continents, off the ocean. The currents and the winds move water around, and it goes round and round. So, it's finite, to be sure, But the interesting thing about water is that it comes back, right? So it's not like you have 10 10 peanuts and you eat 10 peanuts and now you have no peanuts, right? The water is, you can drink your cup of coffee, and eventually you're going to recycle it. You're going to have to go to the toilet and recycle it, and these things come back. So it's a funny kind of a thing that maybe it's scarce in certain parts of the world, but it's also abundant in other parts of the world. Sometimes it's seasonally scarce. Sometimes it's seasonally abundant. Look at California right now. It's underwater. So they keep going on about how climate change is going to mean that California is going to run dry, and now everybody's up to their neck in water. So there's something wrong with the overall narrative. And one of the problems is that we don't build the cyclical nature of the resource into our analyses. We emphasize when it's not there, or when there's too much of it, but not the whole process related to it. That's one thing that needs to change. Another one is that in relation to the water cycle, if you look here, Igor Shiklomanov from the State Hydrological Institute in Russia many years ago, 20 some years ago, attempted to measure all the water on the planet. And, how accurate this is, maybe it's out by an order of magnitude of who knows what. Nevertheless, it's a best guess. And the point to be taken from this is that there's a lot of water, right? So not only does it cycle, but there's more, right? There's more of it, there's lots of it. And with climate change and with sea level rise, with glacial melt, there's actually much more water in the atmosphere now than there has in the past. So, Igor's measures are probably out. So water cycles, and there's a lot of it, right? Yes, sometimes it's not where we want it, when we want it. Yes, sometimes it both too much and too little. Also, maybe the quality's not right, but it's not a function of physical absolute scarcity. And I think we need to move away from that. And it's hard to understand why the water wars discourse, or the water and conflict, or the water and risks to society can't move past the idea that we're going to run out. Now, I think part of the argument is that we've withdrawn massive amount of it, right? Most of the water in the world that we use is irrigated for irrigation. So of the 100% of blue water withdrawn from the groundwater and from surface water, 60-70% on average goes into irrigation. You can see at the bottom there, the lowest one is municipal water. Right, so that's small water. We don't use much of that. We don't require much ourselves. So if cities don't have enough water, if there's not enough water in Sao Paulo, it's not a fact that there's no water available, because we don't need that much. There's more than enough water for people's immediate personal needs, that you can survive and even thrive in some cases. But there are other factors in there that are contributing to the fact that some people have more than enough and others don't have any at all. And yet we say, well, the problem here with all of this withdrawal is the fact that population growth is going up. And you can see global population going up over time, water use going up over time. Yeah, I'm not disagreeing with the fact that there's a correlation between more people and more water use, but there are many people in certain parts of the world, like Japan, who have a very small water footprint. They don't use that much water, and yet they're very wealthy compared to places like the United States, where they use massive amounts of water. But there's also a lot of water poverty and poor people in and around different parts of the United States. So it's not necessarily wealth that determines your absolute, how much you use, but it tends to be a better correlation, that the richer you are, the more water you use. And if you're a rich country, the water features in your agricultural practices, your industrial practices, and so on. So it's not like there's 2 billion Chinese that we're going to run out of water. It's more a function of how we consume that water, who consumes it, for what, and where. And you can ask me questions about this later on. So this is just a graphic of what I just said, that you can see that in terms of consumption of global resources, you can see how skinny Latin America is relative to North America. And that tells you, who is drawing down the world's storage of resources and where the water is going, right? So I think we need to get past the notion that it's population is the cause of water scarcity, and think rather how we use that water for what and where and who benefits from that. A very important issue that has emerged, of course, is groundwater abstraction as a percentage of mean recharge. You can see how North Africa is way beyond its groundwater barrier. They're treating their groundwater like coal, that eventually you'll dig it out of the ground and there won't be any left. This has a lot to do with lifestyle, right? It's mimicking sort of the wet parts of the world, trying to build cities that look like New York or London or Paris. I mean, if you look at Rio, for example, Rio and Lisbon share a lot of the same architecture, right? There's a kind of mimicry, Western mimicry, and if you mimic the West in certain parts of the world that are naturally dry, then you're going to use water. You're going to try to use water in ways that are unrealistic. So what does that mean for your urban security, for your food security, your livelihood security? Is it because there's not enough water, or does it have something to do with the lifestyle choices and the way you've organized your society? There are lots of measures of fresh water and how we're going to run out, and this is a projection of per capita supplies per river basin, freshwater supplies, and you can see how certain parts of the world are much wetter than others. If you look at Brazil, there's so much water in terms of cubic meters per capita on between 4,000 and 10,000, almost nowhere below 1,700 cubic meters per capita. 1,700 cubic meters per capita is thought to be the amount that we need per person per year for a healthy sort of Western style life. So it could be somewhere less than that or more, or more than that, but around 1,700 is for a kind of a high modern Western life. So there should be no water problems across Latin America or in Brazil. So I ask you, who has water problems? Is it because there's a shortage of water? Obviously not. Something else is at play. I'll skip that one. So let me go back to this water wars narrative so I want to get past the presentation and get into the conversation. We keep hearing this thing about the wars of the 21st century will be over water. This was Ishmael Sarah Geldin said this back in 1999. This is a picture of Syria in the background. And there are people, so I had you read Peter Glick's chapter on Syria and conflict in Syria and water's contribution in there. And I would argue very strongly that we must rethink this narrative. I even saw a friend of mine actually posted something on Twitter where he said that is water part of the contribution to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and these kinds of arguments, they just make me wonder why do you want to say that? I mean, these wars are clearly about other things. In some ways, all wars are water wars because water is at the heart of production. We can't live without it. We settle in places that are well watered. Right. So in a way, we fought, we being, whoever has established civilizations and countries and so on, have established themselves in places where water is, where there's arable agriculture, right? Where it rains and you can grow things, right? So you could say every war is a water war. It doesn't mean anything, right? So I'm going to say, so I'll give you some other facts in a second to ask you why we don't put these facts at the center of challenges related to scarcity of the right kind of water for certain kinds of people. We like to think of the climate change as part of and water's contribution there as being part of the four horsemen of the apocalypse. The water wars narrative has come back, I think, because of extreme events worldwide. We've got Arctic sea ice melt, sea level rise, glacial retreat. So there's a lot of people arguing that we're going to water's going to be at the center of our security challenges. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam pops up all the time because it's it's seen as an example of Ethiopia is threatening Egypt's water security by building a dam upstream. Why do we choose to say it that way? I'm not quite sure. And then, as I said, the IPCC AR6, talks about water's fundamental role in climate change. So changing climate is most readily seen in extreme events like droughts, like floods, and so on. And that's why I think this narrative is back in force. It's also an issue, of course, because water is fugitive. It runs across a fixed space. 3 boxes. They could be states, right? They could be surface water. It could be the Amazon. It could be groundwater, right? It could be the Guarani aquifer underneath Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay, and so on. So because we have states and they are fixed in space and time, and we have and this water resource flows and everybody needs it, it's the whole sovereignty bind that we've talked about, and I hope you're going to ask me some questions about that or offer me some observations about that. So, so there's this sovereignty trap that also contributes to this narrative that as that water moves from top left to bottom right, the people at bottom right are worried that the people in top left are going to take everything, and that could lead to conflict. And this, in some ways, is a depiction. You could say it's a depiction of the Nile River Basin, for example. Transboundary basins, this is transboundary basins in the world. 60% of all the countries in the world share river basins. Most of them don't even have a legal regime. They're just water that's shared and not managed formally. But because there's so much water that's shared, the water wars narrative always focuses on the hard cases. Right? What you tend to find are states with weak civil societies. They may be poor. They may be run by authoritarian regimes or kleptocratic regimes. There's something about the relationship, the governance dimension, the quality of the democracy. Is it a performative democracy or is it a real democracy? These kind of elements that play into the hard cases. Right. So if you look at the states here, and if you look at the governance structures within the states, they tend to, this is something we might want to talk about. Is there a direct correlation between governance styles and propensity to rattle the saber, right? To talk about water as a tool for war or as an object of war or something like that. But we look at the Nile, for example, flowing from bottom to top. We look at the Tigris-Euphrates, so-called the cradle of civilization. The Mekong River, you see the yellow part on the right is in China. So there's a lower Mekong River Commission where people are cooperating more or less, but China, the headwaters are in China. People are afraid that China is going to put dams up there and all. So there's these kinds of hard cases. This is a very interesting case, the Indus River, which is often put forward as an example of water cooperation. But if you talk to most people, they'll say this isn't about cooperation around water. It's actually using water for security cooperation between two warring states. So we can talk about that. And of course, there's the Ganges Brahmaputra, another difficult case, and the Jordan, right? So the Jordan is also a very problematic case to look at. So when the water wars always focuses on these cases, they don't look at so much at, for example, Southern Africa, where I've spent most of my time and my research energies. If you look at actually some of the research, this is a conflict cooperation continuum from Aaron Wolf. It's an old study, but I think it's indicative of what the reality is. And the blue is more cooperative, and the red is less cooperative. And what you see there is that no one has ever fought specifically over water, at least not since 4000 BC, something like that. Long ago, before we had other kinds of methods of accessing and delivering water resources. So there's much more cooperation than there is conflict. And then, without going into detail here, I can share this PowerPoint. But what you see, what I like about this is also from the same authors, is that where there is conflict, and what happens is that states conflict and cooperate around the same issue. And it has a lot to do with the fact that that water is bulky and we tend to settle around it, so that because we all need it, yes, we fight over it, but then at the end of the day, there tends to be agreement. So there's much more cooperation than there is conflict, and conflict and cooperation are part of a continuum, and in fact, in many cases can exist. There can be conflict and cooperation between the same two states within the same river basin, as research I did with Joanna Fetch shows on the Zambezi. This shows how much water we need and who uses water differently, right? So access to water is very different around the world. We tend to, when we think of cities, we tend to, there's a narrative around also that there's scarcity. But I want us to think about how much water we actually need as a human being. And if you look at the data, household use varies between 18 and 108 cubic meters per person per year. That's our household use. But human need varies between 600 and 1800 cubic meters per person. That's a huge difference, 1800 and 18, right? So where's the rest of the water? So it's not that we need water in as we see it here in the shower, but we need it mostly in our food, right? We find water in our food. And so really, when we're thinking about places like the Middle East, where there is perhaps absolute water scarcity relative to the number of people there, they have no problems because most of their food is imported in through cheap staple crops, wheat and rice and so on and so forth. So we need a different way of seeing water, right? And there's different concepts, virtual water and so on and so forth. Now, to get near the end of this long presentation, Peter, we talked a bit about the critical and mainstream security studies. I feel like when in relation to water resources, we're trapped in an inter-paradigm debate, leaving the critical side out almost completely. Where on the one side, the realist paradigm, we know water is a resource that serves state power. Transboundary water falls within the purview of the nation state. So states will, threaten each other, set agreements, cooperate, and so on and so forth. The realist side is like, it's like the elephants in the first picture, right? The liberal internationalist paradigm, water is life. It knows no boundaries. It's non-substitutable. We all need it. And so that we need to make agreements, right? So it's not saying that, it's not ignoring the fact that states have the right to determine how water is used and so on. They never question that. But they argue that we, in a more institutionalist perspective, that we can build agreements and cooperate and so on. somewhere in the middle of this is an idea of hydrohegemony. Mark Zeitun and Jerome Warner and a bunch of other people who talk about that there's a mix between, institution building, but also realist action on the part of states like Israel, for example, South Africa as well, I would argue, Brazil definitely on the Guarani Aquifer, also on the Amazon. I had you read those papers on the boomerang effect in Brazil, where the powerful state manipulates both of these kinds of ideas to get what it wants, right? And so, my question is where's this slide? Is this the best we can hope for, right? That the best we can hope for is some kind of capacity building, training, exchange, the liberal idea, right? That what we're trying to do is we're trying to avoid violent conflict, and therefore this is the best that we can hope for. And I feel like we're going round and round in circles. We need to question whose narrative dominates. There's a lot of different ideas out there about what we should be talking about. Green water, virtual water, water diplomacy kind of fits within the liberal institutionalists, as does IWRM, integrated water resources management. All of these other ideas. Near the bottom, there's attempts to try to get us to think differently about what water is and whose it is, to reconsider what we grow. If you think of Brazil and the cutting down the Amazon to put soya, is that a smart idea? Why have we in across much of the savannas abandoned cassava and other drought resistant crops and put in wheat and rice and all of these things that require a lot of water? Why can't we adopt an orphan crop and go back to the ways to thinking sustainably in the context of history? So there's lots of other ways to think about things, but again, I think we're just pulling on two sides, the is of Clausewitz and the ought of Kant. I'm sure that you've read these guys. Now, of course, if we're stuck in this narrative, this leaves us wholly unprepared for the climate change future, right? We have to, and I get it, we live a certain amount of years, states have been around for a few years, but to try to think of Earth system change, it's hard to even conceptualize that in a daily, into our daily concerns, right? And so so I just want to give you an example of what is coming, what I think is coming. What this image shows is that somewhere around 5 million years ago, the last time that CO2 parts per million was above 450, right? So we're somewhere around 450 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere today. The last time that happened was 5 million years ago, estimated 5 million years ago, when there were no polar ice caps, and the coastline of you see here, it's the U.S. East Coast. That line, the dotted line, is where the coastline was 5 million years ago. So what I'm saying is that we're at 450 parts per million. The last time we were like that 180 kilometers, that the coastline was inland 180 kilometers. Is that our future? Does that mean that this is an unstoppable force that is going to put all of us on the run for high ground? If that's a fact, if that's a future, why do we then have to turn back to a narrative around what should the state do? How do I protect my resource? How do I, it's the wrong kind of conversation to have. We need to somehow have a global conversation about these kinds of challenges that demand adaptation. right? And so if we can't have that conversation, if we keep looking at things and saying this poses a danger to the United States and we need to figure out how to secure our water, we'll never get past this dominant narrative. So my last slide, to me, we need new ideas. We need new ways of seeing. There's a lot of good work being out there. There are conversations being had, but in those spaces, the security spaces, the mainstream spaces, those conversations aren't happening there. They're being filtered through the dominant idea that people are stuck in the middle of the sticky floor with ideas all around them, unable to move any farther. So I stopped there. Peter, you're muted if you're trying to say something.
Muted, and that's where I should stay. Thank you very much, Larry. As I suggested to you, wow, wow, wow. What a fantastic presentation. I think we've had an hour of talking and getting ourselves settled in. Our habit is not to break for a 10-minute break, if that's all right with you, Larry.
To break for 10 minutes? Sure.
No, it's not to break for 10 minutes.
No, that's also fine. Yeah.
Okay. So I think we should move into question time. And I will kick off. I wondered, Igor, if the other people in the room, if the other people could come into the studio now. I think you're muted.
No, he's not talking.
I can't hear him.
No, I don't think Igor's saying anything. I don't know if he can hear us. Can you hear us, Igor? Yeah. I think he's attending to matters. No, he can't hear.
Can you not hear us, Igor? Can the rest of the group hear us? Let me ask Louisa if she can hear us.
Yeah, Fernanda can hear. So Peter, let me ask you, okay. I hope the class can see the connections between the readings and the PowerPoint because they're kind of, they run parallel and there's bits of linking, right? So I don't know how we want to, because I'd like to talk about the readings, but also in relation to the, into what I've said and some of the challenges. So I don't know how you want to do that.
So let's start with me asking you, because some of it is quite dense and you use a coded language across it. So let me ask you to explain some of the basic concepts that you use or some of the metaphors you use. And I think the most important one that is so influential in your more recent work is this question of boomerang effect. So could you slow down a little bit and explain what that means and explain its importance?
Sure. Okay, so and again, for me, this is like, who gets to make decisions, right? Who defines the problem? Who decides on the action? And so our research group, which includes Luis Paulo Silva, who's now at University of Salvador in the Northeast, but he's part of this. He's part of the geography department in Sao Paulo, University of Sao Paulo, but also with folks in India and Sweden and Germany. The puzzle that we set for ourselves was, the question we set for ourselves was, states are coming together, interested in reducing carbon emissions, right? So they come together at these through these COP processes, and they establish, NDCs, so nationally determined contributions to climate emissions, carbon emissions reduction. So then they say, okay, what actions are we going to take? And what we see around the world is a rush to the dam, right? I think I posed that as one of the questions for the students, right? That dams are popping up and being built all over the place. Luis Paulo and I and Lars Verkus, wrote about that in one of the papers. So why the rush to the dam? Well, the rush to the dam, because dams are sold as green energy, as clean energy, right? This not carbon. So let's build dams. Let's go into the highlands all around the mountainous areas in Peru and Bolivia and so on. Let's put dams up there. And how can that go wrong? Because that can help us get off of coal or oil and onto hydropower. I think it's a good idea, right? But what you then see is you see these kinds of unintended local level side effects where people are pushed off their land, right? And I think the Belo Monte Dam in Brazil is a very good example of that, right? Where there was pushback from indigenous people. The dam was redesigned, made smaller, but then it was rebranded as a climate action, right? So you've got the Blue Water, hydropower project as a global good. Brazil is contributing to green energy. It helps lower carbon and so on and so forth. So lots of people are writing about the negative side effects, maladaptation of these projects that are conceived at high levels but then enacted at low levels. But our idea was that, do these projects have the capacity? So how do you move states off of these actions, because they're having terrible local level impacts? Is it possible that these climate activities impact state security? Like, use that language, right? Can you use the language of state security to show that that these climate actions should be reconsidered? Are there state level boomerang effects? Can you show that a direct link between all of the money laundering and corruption around tendering in the Belo Monte Dam and the fall of governments in Brazil, right? The so-called car wash scandal, right? And I think, Peter, the last time you and I were together in Brazil, it was during that car wash scandal. So our idea was a kind of a policy-oriented thing. Can we get decision makers, influential people, to think differently about something that is having terrible impacts on people far away, if we can show that they too are being negatively impacted? So that's the boomerang effect. But and we've done other work to say, well, we can also find boomerang effects on companies, in a bunch of different ways to look at it. But the sad fact, it seems to me, is that it's the states see this as the kind of cost of doing business, right? They're not really that interested in how many millions of people are pushed off of the land to have a dam built in wherever, right? Pick a country, right? Because those dams are sited in faraway places, out of sight, out of mind, and that brings electricity into cities, which keeps people quiet. I don't know, it's not doing such a good job for you right now, right? But you can see, like, think of the discourse among the average persons in South Africa right now about, where's the power? Where's my electricity? So if the government was like, let's build let's heighten the Berg River Dam, or let's, people would be all for it. Whether it's realistic or not doesn't matter, right? So it's I think this fits along with the idea about how do you think about problems? How do you get decision makers to see things in a different way that's more, I guess, progressive. And if you defining progression as having less, if we did a sort of a benefit cost analysis, that the benefits far outweigh the cost across the broad range of society as a public good rather than a private benefit, right? How do you do that? And it's not clear to me how that can happen. It seems to me that we've amassed data up to here that shows the so-called maladaptation and the local level side effects. And even as we begin to chronicle the impacts on states, the decision makers, they're not listening. It's like the conversation continues up here at the COP meetings. You make a promise, you do this and that, and we just keep moving without reflection, right? And I know how much the critical security people themselves are caught in their own kind of bubble, but at the same time, some of the ideas there are useful, isn't it? Like the reflexive nature of interrogating your own place on the planet, right? That reflexivity it has to be built into some kind of policy making, and states don't seem to be interested in doing that. So if they're not interested in doing that, how can you ever leave your water security or your livelihood security or your food security up to these people? Right. So something is amiss, and it's not clear to me what is to be done. Right. It's not clear to me how we move forward.
So I want to jump to something else, but just make a comment on what you said. I mean, the interesting thing about dams is that they were also one of the great symbols of modernity.
Yep.
Caught in the development narrative of the 40s and 50s and 60s. So they have this kind of idea of progress embedded in them. What I think you've added a dimension to that, or one of the dimensions you've added to, is the green part of dams now. I don't think that this was a matter of concern in the 1950s when they built Kariba, for example.
Well, which at the moment is something like 11% of capacity. Right. So if it doesn't rain, significantly in that part of the world, there's going to be no power coming out of Kariba at all. But again, like, yes, the bringing, dams are the symbol of power, aren't they? Right. They are a symbol of the state is acting. Right.
Prestige.
Sorry.
Prestige.
Yeah, it's a prestige project. You might as well just put somebody's face on the side of the of the dam, whoever is currently the president, right? And in fact, look at the names of some of these dams, right? Especially the early names of the dams, right? So so in our work we talk about blue water. That's a blue water pathway to climate security. That the dams and its negative effects, but equally important in the Brazilian context is the green water pathway, right? So the green water pathway, green water is, again, a funny concept, but green water is water that's in the soil. It's taken up by plants, right? So if you look around and you see grass outside, that's actually green water, right? Because it's the plant has taken up water out of the soil and used it, right, to grow. So the green water pathway for climate security is through biofuels, and Brazil is the second biggest biofuel producer in the world. The U.S., I think, is the biggest biofuel producer. So we've had this big rush to biofuels, right? And sugarcane. There's a bunch of different kinds of biofuels that some can be food crop residues, some can be cash crop residues, and so on. So, but what you've seen is that you've had this massive shift away from possibly using land for, leaving it as is, let's put it that way. So if you take the Amazon forest, right, leave it as it is as a carbon sink, but also a biodiversity location, and burning that forest down and putting instead crops that you can then turn into ethanol, right? And so that's good, because that's So, but how good is it? You know, like you've reduced the forest, which is a carbon sink, and you've replaced it with this, you know, high intensity, because these crops need a lot of artificial fertilizer, and on and on and on you can go. All kinds of negative consequences. Who owns this land? It's never local people. They get pushed off the land and they go into the forest and so on. So the green water pathway is equally problematic. Now, I just want to make one more point about this, because this, and we wrote a paper some years ago, Luis Paulo and I. We didn't publish it, but South Africa offers a really interesting case in relation to the biofuels question, because as many states were rushing toward biofuels production as a contribution to NDCs and all of that, there was a long discussion inside of South Africa about this. And ultimately, at the end of the day, it was decided that it could not go forward, right? That South Africa was not going to go and become a big player in biofuels production. Why not? For two reasons. One, they said that most water is already accounted for, and so no new water or existing water could be used for biofuels production, right? So it's because, you know, the argument was that South Africa is water scarce, and the water that is allocated as it is. But then some farmers said, well, look, but we grow maize, we can produce biofuel with that. And the government said, well, you can do it locally and fuel your plants and then maybe also feed into the grid, but it can't be a commercial crop. You cannot do commercial biofuel production given South Africa's limited water. Brilliant. You know, how did that happen? It happened because of it's a more robust kind of democracy than most people think, full of antagonistic bureaucracies, right? So the the Department of Environmental Affairs trumps energy in this case. And the commitment to poverty reduction. So the statement that in any climate action had to have poverty reduction at the center of it made it almost impossible that South Africa could get involved in the biofuels markets. It couldn't be done. There's still some experimenting with bamboo production in the Eastern Cape and in KZN, because bamboo grows well in poor soil, and it's drought resistant, and so maybe it could be a job creator on former homelands. So there's still some thinking around that, but it's a beautiful case that needs to be written up and published to show how when you think that governments are not listening at all, here's a case where they did the right thing. And there's a kind of I don't know what necessarily the constellation of political power and social forces inside. I think it's more the government bureaucracy, but it was a positive outcome. It made me hopeful in a number of different ways.
I have a few more questions, but some students are in the room, and Fernanda's there. Do you have a question, Fernanda? Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yes. My question is about we are making a path toward the development of the countries and how they deal with the climate changes and all about that. I don't know if you have an interest in this kind of thing, but there are some traditions, not traditions yet, but some indigenous people that argue that sometimes we need to take a step back in some countries because we imported some models of how to deal with the earth, how to deal with the water, and how to make crops. So we need to take a step back to indigenous knowledge of how to deal with nature. So you can make a bridge to a new form of development that is more qualified to be choose a country, local environment, and etc. So, do you have some reference about this kind of thing and how this can change the way we see security in climate change, and how the countries can exchange knowledge about these new forms that are not new, they are just indigenous and therefore they are forgotten, and how this can make a bridge to another form of how to deal with everything. And another question that I have that I don't know if it's a lot important, there is, I said genocide. And when there is a genocide, there is a lot of people dying in a spot. And when this happened, there are really bad impact in the environment, in the local environment. If there is a water source nearby, this can bring toxins to the water, and everything will just collapse for some times. So I would like to know if there is a literature to deal with climate, with the environment impact of when there's a war or a genocide or other kinds of mass death because of a conflict that will just impact negatively in the country, and therefore there will be another security problem in the long run, because you make environment problem first by killing people. So I would like to know how this cycle can work. Thank you.
Okay. Muito obrigado, Fernanda. So, okay, those are very interesting questions. The one about indigenous ways, I find this to be there's a lot of, especially in Canada, there's a great deal of momentum behind the sort of I guess the decolonization of thinking about development, broadly defined. And of course, there's a lot, there's radical ideas on this. There's more, what would you call it? More liberal kinds of ideas regarding this. You find different kinds of behaviors, and I like the idea. I mean, for me, there's this notion of indigenous people are more as one with nature, right? Technically speaking, the indigenous people were always seen as ecosystem people, right? So they live within the ecosystem. They're dependent on the resource around them for their livelihoods and so on, right? Whereas you and I, we are biosphere people. I've got a computer made in, I don't even, somewhere in Asia, and I don't know who put my phone together. I need global resources to get through my day, right? I'm probably going to go and cook some rice from Thailand later on, right? So I'm a biosphere kind of person, right? And as I showed in that picture about ecosystem, about the footprint, right? You can see the consequences. It's something like, the statistics are like, the Western world, if everybody lived like the West, you would need 6 Earths. There's just not enough resources, right? So clearly, somehow we have to scale back. There's no doubt. Now, if we're talking about, part of the problem, of course, is that we segment everything, right? We turn it into water sector, and and then there's the energy sector, and then there's all of these things are sectorized, right? So if the indigenous people that I know and I've worked with groups here in Canada. I've worked a lot with the San in Botswana over many years. The thing with indigeneity is the conceptual, how you conceive what, who you are and where you fit in what, right? That there's you don't separate out water as an element, as a productive element in society. The water and the landscape is a whole, an integrated whole of which you are a part, right? So that's a completely different way of thinking, right? It's almost like the way the colonists do, they said, okay, there's religion and then there's the state, and they can't meet. But most people I know from global south, if you're Hindu or you're Muslim, this is way of life. It's not a religion, it's way of life. So it's a completely different conceptualization of your place in being. Okay, now how do you reconcile these two? They're still at complete odds with each other, right? Is there evidence of reconciliation somehow? I would say yes. Is it superficial? Perhaps. What do I mean? So in Canada, we have in the West Coast, we have a kind of a liberal institutionalist approach where Indigenous groups are, we've organized basin-wide structures, right? So that we treat the Columbia River Basin, for example, as an entity. And inside of that entity, First Nations people are given pride of place as people to help understand the integrated elements within the health of the entire ecosystem, right? So they are, and they participate, right? They participate within a kind of a Western model of institution. Similarly, you have what are called river keepers, so there are Indigenous groups who are the managers of rivers and the health of rivers and so on. That's meaningful, but it's also kind of I don't know. It doesn't feature in the day-to-day thinking of how I use water. Let's put it that way, right? Another interesting example is in New Zealand, right? New Zealand, Aotearoa, how do you say it? I'm trying to think of the indigenous word of it. I think it's Aotearoa. So New Zealand, right? The indigenous word is Aotearoa. There's a river there that has been given personhood, right? So there's a river that's been acknowledged as having rights of a legal person. And Indigenous groups who worked for decades to try to regain access to the resource, not just the river, but the entire watershed. People who worked for decades cite this as a landmark success, that the river has rights, that the river is, like, you can't just go and do anything to it. It has rights. And the river is not just the river, but it's the basin itself, right? Okay, that seems to me to be progressive. But how does the river represent itself? So what has happened is that the river is represented by a trust, right? And the trust is comprised of different groups within of stakeholders within the basin. So in a way, on one side it looks extremely progressive, that it's a different way of thinking about what is this thing. But on the other hand, it's been fit straight into an ordinary kind of institutional state entity. That in order for, if something happens to the river, we have.
Professor Larry? Oh yeah, I think the batteries is off now.
Okay, so I'm back on the
Great.
computer. Okay, my apologies. So I mean, that tells you how long we've been on this thing, right? So yeah, so is that progressive? I don't know, but you know, to me, you know, if you in Swahili you say pole pole, you know, you go slowly. You know, you have to try to, you know, I mean, undoing 500 years of colonialism and 300 years of Western high modern industrialism can't be done in a couple of seminars. You can't do it. So I don't know that we actually know how to think about these things. But I encourage you to try to think about these things. I think it's so important. The other question about you know, environmental impacts of wide scale, like take the Ukraine for example right now, right? I mean, that place is just decimated. So the environmental impact is going to be so long lived, right? The United Nations has an environmental peace building arm. And so you know, so and there's a post-conflict element where the idea is that you bring groups together in some kind of low stakes engagement, something that everybody's agreed on is necessary. So you clean up a water body, or you detoxify some, you know, you remove mines, or you know, whatever it is, right? Something that all sides will benefit from through a cleanup exercise, right? And so that's generally understood to be called environmental peace building, right? So the idea that you can rehabilitate the land and rehabilitate social relations through these kinds of exercises. And there's an environmental peace building association, of which I just happen to be the new vice president. And it's a global association, and we have a special rate. So we have a special rate for students. So I think you should look it up on the internet. We have many Latin American members, and we have different interest groups. So there's a water interest group and education interest group, and so on. And there's several young people from the University of Sao Paulo who are active in some of those things. So I encourage you to look at that. Okay, so thank you for that. Can I ask you a question? Right, and so my question to you is one of the questions that I asked of everybody. Like, what is the relationship between security and certainty?
This is a question you answered at a different time in your life. In your 20s, you answer it one way. In your 60s and 70s, you answer it in another way.
Yes, Fernanda.
I was thinking about it after reading the text and all. There is a kind of predictability of some things, but I think looking at what I study, and there's just too many changes happening all the time, and the world is too complex for a certain kind of stability and how I would like to say it.
Yeah, I think you're right about predictability.
Certain things, yes. So certain security is highly moving from one way to the other, as we need more things, and the environment changes, the society changes, and all. So I think it's highly linked, but at the same time, they are just pushing into opposite directions.
Yes.
Because you can't predict the future?
Well, okay, that's an interesting. I was with you until the last sentence, right? Because I mean, maybe you can't predict the future, but you can model based on trends, okay? Right. So there, and part of the problem with climate change, of course, is that we don't, you don't know. There's too many variables. The information is always changing, but it doesn't have to be in relation to climate change. We can say, for example, if you take rainfall where you are, right, you can measure rainfall, year after year, and you end up with some kind of trends, and that helps you, understand how, when you have water, where it is, what the quality is, how fast the flow is, and so on, right? So, and then knowing that will then allow you, right, to then plan, right? And since everybody needs water, somehow you need to be able to have some element of certainty, right? So, one of the interesting things about security, though, right, is the fact that, I guess Ulrich Beck and others have talked about risk society, right? That we tolerate risk, right? That we we know that there's like 5,000 nuclear weapons out there somewhere, right? But it's like, doesn't stop us from going to the store and buying a soda or something like that, right? There's a kind of a tolerable risk, right? And so, but are there thresholds, right? So in terms of security, the search for certainty is partly, so that you can know that tomorrow will look like today if you want it to be, or tomorrow can look different from today if you want it to, right? Right. So, so I think, I think that's a simple way of thinking about it, right? But then the logical next question, of course, is like, who gets to decide, right? And I think that's the main issue. Like, if you look at the world today, right, the war in Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has pushed everything off the table, right? So all other kinds of narratives have been crowded out, and the space is occupied by the generals and by by all the security experts, and they're here to tell us, and it's like, so how do you have a conversation, right? Because what their desire for a kind of predictability is different than than perhaps yours and mine, right? They just want Russia to go back into its own box and stay there, right? But what does that mean? What does that mean for actual, for the well-being of us, right? Right. So I think, for me, again, I'm back to this, and Professor Vale's prompt is about, how do we think about these things? But I think even more so, how, is there a way? And I personally, I'm constantly probing for ideas in relation to water, for new ways of presenting information to people who are more or less unwilling to listen, because they're pretty much happy with the way things are. So you're always trying to come at them. You're like the zebra in and around those elephants. You're trying to come in somehow and say, what about sharing? How about that? Or could I, I'm a small elephant. How about that? I'm not a zebra. I'm a small elephant. So I'm part of the group. So new ways of saying things, new ways of packaging information, new measures, right, to try to shift that conversation. But I think the war in Ukraine has shown us how easy it is to just push it back, right? And where do we go from there? I don't know. I mean, I'd like to know, from you, what has happened in your own. It doesn't have to just be Fernanda. I'm sure there's other students on the call here. But what has that war so far away from you in Brazil done to the discourse around security and stability in Brazil, or in not even Brazil, in your neighborhood, right? Because we talk about different scales, and somehow, for some reason, the state scale takes precedent over everything else, right? So how, how is that, for me, I know in particular what it's done, trying to get this project off the ground in South Sudan, approaching partners who normally would work with us. They said, the war in Ukraine is, the budgets are all upside down now, and we've frozen all projects and all funding and all of that. So, so it's had ripple effects right down to, drilling wells in rural areas. So in faraway places, right? So, so if that's a direct impact, what do we do about it? I don't even know who to have a conversation with, about these things.
Yes, I was thinking about when I say that we don't know what tomorrow will bring us, is there is a point in Ethiopia before the drought in 1984 that the government, the RRC, was saying we will collapse. There is a drop in the rain coming and everyone will starve, and they just start screaming about it over and over and over. But the state was in a process where Mengistu just said, we cannot do anything about it. We'll just let these people starve because I cannot lose the power. So things came to be the size that it turned out. So I think the people in power usually can just turn their backs to really important things about climate change and everything about it. So I just feel uncomfortable with how the government choose to deal with this kind of things. And when there's a change in government, this transition phase usually will bring some high impacts on this kind of thing, because we usually see each government focus on specific things and not the whole, not building a state, but building their power on this lead. So I think I just feel some kind of uncertainty, but maybe this is a result of the scenario in Brazil and how you just were stuck in this really uncomfortable, uncomfortable
Yeah.
Place with Bolsonaro and the rise of this conflict between inside our society. So I just got stuck. But when we see the impact of some place, not only the rain will flow from one country to the other, and it will impact our food and other types of resources. And so we need to all prepare for this kind of thing. But I see a lot that the migration problem is related to it, and there is a whole security build on how the migration is a problem, and especially when when it flows to other states and the security problems rise. So I think we just don't escape from it. We can just escape, and there is the food that we produce and sell to the Africa or other states. And if we have some problem here, we can sell it. And therefore, our economy will suffer. So there's a rise in prices, or the prices fall, and we can eat in a secure way. So I just I just got lost because it's an ocean of information and just too much to take sometimes.
Yeah, well, so, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, can I just jump in here, because I think it's such an important question, and maybe push you directly on one of the questions which I thought, and I think this is, if I can second guess Fernando, this is exactly the point. You are very silent in your presentation on the relationship between water and money and economics and the privatization of water, which is a debate that's gone on in many parts of the world. Could you say something about that? Because it's not simply the state, the military, etc., etc. It's the whole economic superstructure of what's going on in the world. So could you say something about that?
Yeah, definitely.
Great build up, Fernando.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, it's implied in some of the things I've said, right? You know, I did talk about, I mean, dams. You know, dams are a choice because the constellation of social forces is such that you know, the banks and the companies and the tenderpreneurs, you know, are the ones who are supporting these enterprises. The discourse around neoliberalism and the attack on the state and so on is pernicious and persuasive to many people. You know, like lots of my students who've here in Canada who are the children of refugees, you know, have come from states that they don't want the state involved in water supply, right? They would rather have, you know, a private kiosk that they can depend on, that where they can get their water, or have you know, some French company do the same thing. So you know, I have to always check my, you know, Canadian privilege at the door, right? Because, you know, because even here, people, I mean, a lot of people buy bottled water, even though we spend so much energy and effort and tax money to make sure that the water that comes out of my tap is tastes nice, you know, and is safe. There's just this distrust of the state, and so the distrust of the state runs deep, and I think opens the door for the commoditization of things, right? It's not so much it's not so much privatization of delivery as it is the commoditization of a public good, of something that everybody needs. And that to me is more dangerous. It's privatization, fine. Let a company be the private provider, you know, that's fine. In our book, Dr. Cash and I, in our book on political economy of urban water security under climate change, many different models of delivery, all involving private enterprise in most cases. But it doesn't mean that water is conceptualized as simply an input into industrial production or GDP or something like that, but that it is in some places still seen as a public good, and there is, if not state oversight, that the regulatory environment is such that you know, people are happy to pay and paying a rate that's reasonable for them. You know, I think we studied 13 cities, mega cities around the world, including Sao Paulo and Cape Town in there, and so it's not so simple about as privatization is bad, public is good, and I have to always remind myself that. There's quite a move back toward public-private partnerships and try to capacitate local municipal systems of delivery, and to capacitate municipal governance in general, because if you're going to have effective oversight of private enterprise, you need a government a level of government that can actually do that. So there's more, and there's a move toward what's called remunicipalization, so that taking away like the failed Cochabamba experiment, for example, that everybody talks about, has led to this move back to the water being 100% under municipalities. But there are, of course, private people coming and managing putting the pipes in the ground and, fixing the well points and all sorts of things like that. So again, I'm back to the kind of idea about what is water? Like, what is it? Is it just a factor of production? Is it just something you drink? Is it part of our well-being? Is it a constituent element of an ecosystem with which we can't? Is it all of those things, right? So it's much more complicated. It's a much more complicated element. It's hard even to know what to call it, because once you say it's something, it's a commodity, it's a resource. Once you name it, you send an analysis down a particular direction. But it brings me back again to this, to the dominant discourse around, and it's a high modern discourse. You were right to point that out earlier, Peter, about dams, right? It's like, it's the symbol of power. Power meaning economic power, political power, military power at the end of the day, the power to waste water, right? To take, showers, endless showers, and let the water run out to sea if you're living in a coastal area, right? So it's a symbol as much as anything else. And it's for those reasons, I think, that maybe, Fernanda, when you get lost in the sea of all this information, what I always try to do is I always try to remember that it's not black and white, right? That you will find allies wherever you look in any kind of organization or entity. So, you have to build your network. That's why you must join the Environmental Peace Building Association. You'll find good people in there. It's private sector, government, IFIs, IGOs, academics, individuals, all coming together, talking past each other, because we're interested in water, but we have different interests and can't see the same thing. But you have to sort of like find your people and find a way to sort of have those conversations. That's one thing. The second thing is that and I'm learning this, at a later stage in life and in my career, is that you really do have to listen to people whose opinion you disrespect. I just read a book called Markets in the Environment. It's a textbook on a course on environmental regulation, and it made me so uncomfortable, right, to read this book. Even squeamish at points. But I kept saying to myself, look, these people have influence. You need to be able to hear them and understand them, right? So that's another thing. You have to try to push yourself to read outside your comfort zone. And then the last thing is to think about scale, right? So, okay, the big picture is overwhelming, but there's things you can do right around you if you just put your arms out straight, there's something at the end of each arm in that radius that you can probably attend to, right? And it will make a difference, right? And I think you see these things that, a good thing about bad governance is that in some cases, and I think this is a case in Brazil, is you have strong civil society, right? That in some countries you have bad governance, Iran, and you have weak civil society. So people can't, they're hostage, they're held hostage. But in lots of parts of the world, and I lived in Nigeria, and even in places like Botswana, where people think the government is a wonderful democracy and so on, what you find is that where government is absent and ineffective, people can be effective and collective and cooperative. And you see lots of these things. One of the things we learned about in doing the Cities book is to see all the mobilization at that scale, community level, and pushing for, because you can see government at the municipal level. There they are, right? They live in the same area. So you can get get busy with trying to strategize around things. And that's at a meaningful life. And then, I don't know, maybe things, can scale up or scale across, comparatively across cities, across communities, across neighborhoods in your own city, and so on. So I think there's, many kinds of strategies for positive action, and, personal security, livelihood security, household security, all of these different kinds of securities that I laid out in that one chapter that I had you read about global water crises and challenges for water security, right? So I can be hopeful. If you look at it that way, you can be hopeful. But if you stay up at that top level, and you see what comes out of COP27 and and the biodiversity meeting COP15, or what's happening between the U.S. and Russia and Ukraine and so on, you feel somehow fatalistic. And again, I think that's part of the problem of the security discourse. What is the information they're sending you? It makes you feel helpless, isn't it? Right. So, I encourage you to find a different narrative pathway to try to see things differently, and ask questions.
I see Louisa's there. I'm sure she has a question. We're getting towards the end of the session, but I'm sure she has a question to ask.
Yeah, so Larry just kind of answered my question, because something we always come across in Peter's classes are thinking about like this sovereignty trap that you mentioned in one of the readings. And I feel like maybe because in international relations, we're always kind of stuck at the global level and thinking about the state. And too often, like in issues like water security and other kind of issues, the state doesn't feel like it's doing enough, or like it's going towards some kind of solution, or being like propositive in what it's trying to do. So I was going to ask, what do you think, like how we can move beyond this trap, trying to escape this trap? And I think you already answered it by maybe looking to the local level to like the small things that are being done that end up adding up. But I guess it makes me think, do you feel like this is enough so that we can move towards like addressing these changes? Because at the end of the day, it always feels like, okay, so maybe we need to have like a global collective solution. And it's okay, so we kind of need to rely on the states, but the state's not enough. So, I mean, how do we address this? How do we try to think of new ways to address these issues?
Well, this is one way right now, having these kinds of conversations, right? I mean, you shouldn't underestimate the value of not only these kinds of conversations, but these kinds of platforms. I don't even know whatever this thing is called. This platform is new to me, StreamYard, but StreamYard, Zoom, we are, we can connect, like it's almost many years ago, I talked about I had this idea about getting Gulliver to learn. I'm sure none of you know who Gulliver is. And Robert Louis Stevenson wrote this book back in the 1800s, I think it was, the 1700s. And he imagined this guy as going around the world, and in some places he was tiny, in some places he was a giant. And he ends up in this place called Lilliput, and the Lilliputians are these tiny, tiny little people, but they managed to trap him, right? And so he's on the beach, and he wakes up, and he's tied down on the sand, and all of these tiny little people working together have managed to trap him, right? And so so back then this is a metaphor for me, and I call it the Lilliputian's dilemma. How do you get Gulliver to learn, right? Can you tie Gulliver down and then give him a lecture? Like, how do you do that, right? And so, but I still like the idea of ties, right? Of ties, right? I mean, Granovetter in the governance paper talks about the strength of weak ties. these kind of linkages that we have. And I want to give you, I'm just going to, as you were talking about sovereignty trap and sovereignty, and in thinking, in driving to the airport last night with my Somali, Canadian permanent resident, but Somali-born cab driver, I had this idea about, Somalis and Somalia, right? So like, what is Somalia? And I think, if you can look at it like this, I drew it here, right? So we've got, like, you can't really see here, it's Horn of Africa, right? So you've got Somalia, right? That's Somalia, right? But if you think about, this is my high-tech stuff, right? But if you take that but then what is that Somalia, or is this Somalia, where the point, right? Where the point is where Somalia is geographically, right? But all of these strands are the kind of nodal points that connect Somalis globally, worldwide, right? And these are and these are strong links through clans, through all kinds of where you were born, things like that. Money flows along these strands, and so there are other forms of social. There are other social forms that are meaningful beyond the state, right? And I agree with you 100%. We're obsessed and overwhelmed by the sovereignty trap. And we cannot not think about it, right? We have to think about it, right? But like I said in my presentation, is the best we can do liberal institutionalism. I still think that is something that we have to try to resuscitate global governance. I have no doubt about it, or regional governance, or these different kinds of entities, right? Trying to get governments to how do you get them to give up sovereignty, right? EU style, giving up some sovereignty, right? I think that's a worthwhile exercise, but I think you owe it to yourself to look at these other social forms that are actually effective and functional around the world, right? I mean, corporations also do the same thing, right? I mean, you could just as easily, I remember once going into the De Beers headquarters building in Johannesburg in 1994, I think it was. And there's a giant map of the world on the wall made out of some kind of paper mache or ceramic, something, I don't know what. There's not a state line anywhere, but there are points everywhere of where's gold, where's diamonds, where's bauxite, where's, so it's a world map of, according to the company's interest in the resource, right? And so there's many different ways to draw the world, to see the world, to see the connections, huh? And I think we owe it to ourselves to try to, to think about that. What does that mean? And how do you introduce that into conversations and spaces? Maybe Peter, next time we, because one of the last times we met, it was actually my birthday. I mean, the only time in my life where I had the Brazilian military buy me a birthday cake. But we didn't quite use that space to talk to how people who are part of the state apparatus, whether they're like the high military side or they're a functional element within a bureaucracy somewhere, how they navigate their own lives, right? Because you're not just the state. You are also an individual, a parent, a child, whatever, many things, right? A dancer, a musician, so we are many things. So, so maybe, trying to humanize the state. Who is, we talk about opening up the black box of the state to understand foreign policy. How about opening up the black box of the state's person, right? To figure out, who are they? What makes them tick? What makes them move? I mean, if there's ever a case for the psychology of leadership, it's Donald Trump and it's Jair Bolsonaro, right? And it's Vladimir Putin. So I think, maybe this is a bit of an unsatisfactory answer. I'm an academic, so I'm always interested in how do we reshape, reframe, rethink, come together, Yesterday, I sat in on a new working group, a global working group on women in water, and so they've come together and they've got some kind of a project going, and so it's a network of like-minded people with a and I think we owe it to ourselves to go back to that complexity and to try to don't lose sight of the sovereignty trap, but trap the sovereignty trap in a web of complexity and other ways of seeing, knowing, and being.
Professor Peter Vale, I'm not sure how is our time going, but I couldn't make my questions before, so I still have. I still have a couple of questions. I had an issue with my mic, so I needed to take my gamer resources here to get it working again. So. Professor Swatuk, actually, I wanted to bring the discussion back to two terms related to security. One is securitization, and the second is technology. Minutes ago, you asked us about the war in Ukraine and the changes it promoted or created to everybody in the world. So, but in Brazil, I believe that is maybe a change related to the new ways the left parties are identifying themselves, because in Brazil we had decades of developmentalism related to industrial production and the need of creating big projects to supply energy for this industrial commitment of the government and so on. But now, since the new right parties in United States, in Europe, as well as in Brazil, they are going they are creating new identities. I believe Ukraine war and the position of Brazil in BRICS, they are being maybe reviewed, and even the PT party is getting a more progressive discourse towards the inclusion of the interests of indigenous people, a more inclusive discourse regarding minorities and so on. So maybe we couldn't see nowadays the building of a new hydroelectric power plant such as Belo Monte again during a new PT government, because the left parties and the left governments may have changed now. So maybe democracies and governed by left parties, they will have a new momentum to understand the needs of water requirements and new and more sustainable water policies. But maybe so I'm more optimistic regarding government. So I believe governments can and maybe political parties still have a role in this debate. So, but my problem is that this whole transition and movement from a more a discourse securitizing a traditional model of development that our PT party promoted before, and now a new discourse securitizing the life of indigenous people and representation of minorities. We could see a change of securitization discourse, and the media pressed the government and the PT party to address those new commitments. So there was, in my point of view, there was a change of securitization discourse, but I'm not sure if the securitization is a solution. So because it's it brings back the idea of emergency and existential threat. But is it the solution? Because we are still pretty much an object of emergencies or urgency policies, and we don't debate clearly the I don't know, the substance of those policies and the planning in a more medium and longer term. So maybe when we get a new Bolsonaro government, everything is going down again. So this is one of my issues and my preoccupation. So and the second one is technology, because even if we adopt a new model of development and taking seriously the idea of green economy and technological changes, we still have in poor countries or even in medium powers or global south leaders a problem of getting technology. So even in Santa Maria, here is a city in the countryside, Brazil. If all the houses, and if we have a municipality policy that try to install, solar energy in all the residents in the city, and tries to implement a new policy, the technology doesn't come from Brazil and doesn't come from our economy. It doesn't come locally. So we need to import the whole bunch of technology from global north countries, as well as the products, the industrial basis of these projects from China. So I believe the capital, the enterprises are more eager to the new green economy to get done and to get implemented, because they will profit as well. So how can we struggle with that technology can be spread and can produce employment in these poor countries as well? Because otherwise these people won't have alternatives to get employed, because the modern and the industrial basis, one of the legitimacy of this model of economic development was employment, and nowadays the transition gets maybe more inequality in world economies, and maybe a more a crucial division of labor that we are not maybe thinking about and discussing about. So these 2 points, securitization and technology, how can we deal with those two things?
Wow, those are great observations, and if I had the answers to those questions, maybe I could sell my services to Lula's new government.
Yeah, great.
Yeah. But they're worth reflecting on it and discussing in more detail. I mean, if you read our paper with where Luis Paulo was the first author, about the new left, what's scary about I'm not so confident about the new left and green development or more environmentally sensitive development, because these people more or less are all products of the high modern age, and so so it takes me also back to the African context in the 1960s, when all of the countries became independent. All of these leaders were schooled in the West and had that mindset, of development is the big dam, it's this, right? So what you're seeing in the case that we were looking at is that Bolivia, Peru, many of the left-leaning governments now are cooperating on the big dams, because this is seen to be jobs and energy security and that sort of stuff. So again, I'm back to my kind of this is a great idea, but then it might have unintended consequences. How do you have a conversation about that? I'm not so sure. So that's not quite about the securitization, but it's more about the ideological predisposition of governments, left or right. They're still sort of modernization focused, it seems to me. And as such, I guess how do you get their attention about indigenous people or the Amazon or something? You have to pose it as an emergency. Outsiders are trying to securitize it so that governments take it seriously, because otherwise they don't really give a damn. I love your idea about you said we are the object of emergency policies. It's so true. So what you are seeing, right, with climate emergency this is exactly where our boomerang effect was trying to probe, is that there's climate emergency. We must act. States come together. They agree on nationally determined contributions for emissions reduction. And then they're like, well, what do we do? Well, you rush to dams, you rush to biofuels, but then you also start looking around and, what am I already doing that could be called a part of the NDC? And so you are busy relabeling activities, so everything. And in fact, China has said that they're not going to bother trying to work through their developmental programs and say this is climate centered, or this is sort of climate centered. They've simply said everything we do is about being climate friendly, so we're not going to bother trying to parse this out. So climate emergency, taking action ill-considered. What are the impacts? Well, a lot of it is maladaptation and negative side effects at the local level. So what do we do with that? It's like you can only get their attention if you say the house is on fire, but then it gets the wrong firemen, it gets the wrong people into the room. So again, I'm not quite sure. Maybe it has something to do, maybe a better approach is to try to see who Lula appoints to key positions and try to find, so in Canada, for example, we have a feminist international assistance policy, which is a consequence of hard work by feminist-oriented NGOs in Canada, working the bureaucracies, their links in government at lower levels, and trying to build from below, which of course could be undone if the Conservative Party wins the next election. But nonetheless, it shows a strategy of placement of people to help you see things differently. I've got lots of friends now who work in the World Bank, and it's very funny to me to turn to them for advice when I'm morally opposed to the World Bank. It's this, but that's what I'm saying, is that, okay, beyond securitization, maybe it's about identifying and pointing out the fact that we need the proper person into the in these positions. Maybe not. The technology one, Brazil is a classic case of what's called dependent development, right? Maybe you've read Gary Gareffi and all these guys, and much of the 8th biggest economy in the world or something like that, busy with the French with your nuclear submarine, and you've got all high tech production and so on. So capacity is there. I think there's the capacity is there, but how do you turn it toward in the direction that you want, right? How do you frame the argument about technological dependence? It's probably a propitious time to make this argument anyway, because the COVID-19 and the war in Ukraine has pushed the world back toward an anti-globalization perspective anyway, isn't it? So So, you could make the case of saying, jobs, the usual case, jobs, keeping capital inside the country to facilitate, money for services and so on, to be attached to, and maybe that's part of regulations regarding greening, green economy or ecological modernization activities. It's about, what are the criteria for action? Can you just rush to, I wonder, I don't know anything, maybe you know better than me, but so much of the Latin America's soya goes to China, right? Are they sending you, wind turbines in return, right? Because that's a classic that's old-fashioned dependency, right? So somehow, if there's going to be, dependent development's characterized by external corporate investment, right? Long-term investment inside of Brazil to try to tie down some of that activity, but it makes you dependent on external inputs, right? For production. Canada is the very same thing. We put together cars, but most of the parts come from the US or Mexico or somewhere else. So I think that's more about strategies around regulation, maybe interrogating the regulations, looking at the regulations, rather than just saying, we are supporting green economy, end of story. Okay, well then what, right? And then it's the boring stuff, the nitty gritty, to look at the policies that are being enacted. What are the regulations attached to that policy? Oftentimes there's, you have to have smart partnerships. There's something there. I'm not quite sure, but maybe there's some ideas there that you can work with.
That's great. Thanks very much, Professor Swatuk. Professor Vale?
Yeah, I think, Larry, we've been at it for 2 and a bit hours. I want to thank you on behalf of the students, who you only see a small 2 of them here. There are more, I think, in a different viewing of this. I don't really understand what's going on here, but thanks. I want to thank you on behalf of the students and our course for this contribution. It's just been fantastic.
Right. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
No, just thanks a lot, and it's a privilege. It's always, like I said, Fernanda and Luisa, you have to carry these things forward, right? So I'm so happy to see you, and please feel free to reach out to me anytime for any reason, okay? And whoever else is, in the background, the students who are hiding.
Okay, so just thank you for that. Just on a small thing, or quite a big thing for the students, we meet next week, same time, and we're going to have Mariana and Renata talking to us about feminist perspectives on security. So that's the agenda. I want to thank everybody who put this together. Igor, thank you very much. Louisa, Fernanda, thank you. And I'll leave it over to Igor to wrap the thing up.
Thank you again. Many thanks, Professor Larry Swatuk, Professor Peter Vale, all the students. They've been watching here inside the StreamYard room, as well as through YouTube, and people that will check the video later on. Thanks very much, Professor, for your time, your attention, and your brilliant insights. And see you soon. Thanks very much.
Right. Thanks a lot. Maybe we see each other in person one of these days. Okay. All right. Bye.
Bye.